Thank you very much, Stuart, for that introduction, and also to everyone who's gathered here. I'm now peering into the dark and I can no longer see you, but it's great to see so many people here, and thank you all very much for coming along. Since my time as a postgraduate student back in the years of the first Thatcher government in 1979 to 83, I've been fascinated by the cultural dimensions of war and of violent political conflict. And most of my research and much of my teaching in higher education has explored the domain of culture and experience and memory, involving meanings, feelings, values, identities, as this is affected by and responds to conditions of war and conflict. In my more recent work, I've become especially interested in how those living afterwards, in the so-called post-war or post-conflict cultures and societies, relate to and engage with war and conflict that is now over, that is said to be in the past. But these terms, post-war and post-conflict, are slippery and problematic. First, we might ask, when exactly is, or was, the time of the post-war? In Britain, we still commonly refer to the Second World War as the war, despite it having ended nearly 70 years ago, and despite the British state's involvement in a substantial number of further wars and armed conflicts since 1945. By post-war, we usually mean the months and years immediately following the end of hostilities in 1945, the late 40s and the 50s certainly, the 1960s possibly, but ending when? Our continuing reference to the war implies that we think of ourselves as living still within an epoch significantly defined by the end of the Second World War, the Allied victory, the defeat of fascism and Nazism. But does that mean Britain is still a post-war culture? A second problem encountered in using these terms is that it's not always possible to identify a tidy historical break, neatly dividing a before from an after, and so distinguishing the time of war from the time of peace that follows after violence is ended. Many conflict zones around the world can be characterised by their susceptibility to the return of the violent past, to the reproduction of political violence in the present, giving rise to the perception of history repeating itself or of continuities between present and past in a long history of conflict. Reflecting on experiences in conflict zones of the 1990s, including Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, the writer Michael Ignatieff famously remarked that the past continues to torment because it's not past, it's not over, finished, completed, but it permeates the social and psychic realities of everyday life in the present. This opens up some complex questions of time and of temporality. For those whose lives are conducted within the temporal frame of what I call the present past, its effects are neither easy to understand nor can they be readily shrugged off. In attempting to grasp this phenomenon, we use a range of concepts and metaphors. War and conflict are said to cast shadows forwards in time, shadows that persist long after the violence has ended. What is past may be described as haunting the present, populating it with ghosts and spectres. Past violence can be understood to deposit residues or remains, material but also psychological leftovers or traces of an unresolved or incomplete process of transformation. These may be thought and felt to possess an afterlife, even a half-life, like radioactive substance, a metaphor that captures the sense of this persistence as something baleful or malign. This quality also permeates the concept that I currently favour and I've used in the title for this lecture, that of the legacies of the violent past. A legacy is something that's bequeathed, handed down or passed on from a previous time to posterity, such as property, knowledge, skills, often crossing from the older to the younger or future generations. It may be benign in intention or effect, but when used in the context of war and conflict, legacy more usually refers to the negative, destructive and malign outcomes and consequences that are felt to be a burden or an overshadowing. When we talk of drawing a line under the past, of stepping out of its shadow, laying it to rest, letting it go, moving on, these metaphors of mastery signify, as Paul Grady puts it, a need to liberate the present and future from the burden of the past that threatens to overwhelm them. Historical cultural studies has a particular contribution, I think, to understanding, particular contribution to make, I think, in understanding these complex temporalities in post-war and post-conflict circumstances. Questions of experience, of feeling and affect, of memory, of voice, are of crucial importance if we're to make human lives and needs central to our understanding of war and conflict, and also of the work of what Jean-Paul Lederac has termed conflict transformation. That is, the work to transform cultures of violence according to visions of just and sustainable, peaceful futures. Cultural studies can also illuminate how we come to this work from different positions, both inside and outside the locations and the histories of war, and what is involved with engaging with others, including the enemy, across these differences. In what follows then, I'm going to reflect on legacies of war in culture, memory and experience, and the work of transforming them within three contrasting locations: Britain, Northern Ireland and Palestine. First, though, I want to say a few words about the three concepts: culture, experience and memory, by way of introducing my practice of historical cultural studies. Cultural studies is itself a post-war critical phenomenon. One of its foundational figures, the socialist public intellectual Raymond Williams, fought as a tank commander in Western Europe after D-Day in 1944, and his path-breaking books, Culture and Society, 1780 to 1950, published in 1958, and The Long Revolution of 1961, sought to understand the new way of life emerging on the basis of post-war reconstruction, the welfare state, consumer capitalism, and its potential for further democratic transformation. Williams' analyses of the post-war present are situated within a longer social and cultural history of class, of what he called lived experience, and of the struggle for progressive forms of social and political organisation in the modern era since the Industrial Revolution. I was first introduced to Williams' work as an undergraduate at Sussex University in the mid-1970s, and this is one of the many reasons I'm indebted to Professor Stuart Lang, who was my tutor then, as he's alluded to, and has been a mentor to me ever since. Williams' definition of culture, in terms of lived experience and the articulation of meanings and values and effects within a whole way of life shaped by history, was instrumental in helping me make sense of where I came from, who I was, what I was even doing at a university. Williams' thinking made it possible to place myself and my family as historically formed and positioned in relation to conflicting value systems and associated meanings of social life and political struggle. Williams also emphasised the importance of cultural agency, that is, the work undertaken by historically situated people in the making of meanings, the challenging of received and dominant understandings and frameworks for making sense, and the articulation of the felt or lived texture of personal and social experience. Williams was particularly interested in social experience that's marginalised, subordinated, or actively suppressed within a dominant framework of meaning. His focus lay on social class, but the principles have helped to shape certain kinds of feminist and anti-racist and anti-colonialist cultural practice and politics. Williams occupies a significant place in the development of the Birmingham School, so-called, of Cultural Studies, named after the Birmingham University Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, where I studied for my PhD. Ways of thinking historically about culture drew as well on the work of Stuart Hall, its director, from 1968 to 79. For Hall, a post-war Caribbean migrant to Britain, knowing where we come from, geographically and historically, is vital to our sense of identity and of agency in the world. However, recovering our past requires a way of thinking and speaking about that past within available discourse. Hall writes, "We bear the traces of a past, the connections of the past, but returning to the past is never a return of a direct and literal kind. The past isn't waiting for us back there to ground and recoup our identities against. It's always narrated, retold, rediscovered, reinvented. We go to our own pasts through history, through memory, through desire, not as a literal fact." In my work, that's been deeply influenced by the popular memory group of researchers at the Birmingham Centre during the early 1980s. I used the term cultural memory to signify the process whereby a social group understands and represents events or experiences that have occurred or are believed to have occurred in its past. Memory forms the sense of a living connection between past and present. Cultural discourses of memory, composed of narratives and images, inform cultural maps of meaning that enable people to live in a particular environment and to make sense of their personal and social experience. Memories also play an important part in constituting collective identities and belongings through communities whose members share a sense of a common past and a set of remembered reference points that encapsulate their key values. We draw upon discourses of cultural memory in shaping our personal memories of the past and engage in memory work as individuals and within our social groupings and networks, which in turn brings about changes in discourse. The concept of cultural memory also points to a two-way interaction at work between the past and the present. The legacy of the past imposes itself upon, could even be said to structure, how we experience and represent ourselves and our lives. But as active agents of remembrance, we work to recall, understand, and make sense of this legacy through stories and other representations in the context of our present-day realities and aspirations. Now, I want to turn now to my first case study of post-war or after-war culture, that of the Second World War in Britain. And I'm going to begin with this photograph. This, to my eyes, beautiful young couple is my mum and dad. Cathy and Frank Dawson, née McMahon, photographed on their wedding day, 5th of August, 1946, at St Peter's Roman Catholic Church in Doncaster. This was a post-war wedding. My father's in army uniform. He was conscripted age 18 and a half in November 1944, and he wasn't demobbed until January 1948. But for these two 20-year-olds, the war was over and a different peacetime future beckoned. 10 years later, as a post-war baby, I was born into and grew up in the afterwards of the Second World War in Britain during the 1950s and 60s. My earliest childhood memories include fragmented traces of the war. Memories of, for example, a Doncaster bomb site a block away from our new-build council house, and of visiting my mother's dressmaker, who was blonde-haired when my mother's hair was black, who spoke with a strange and to me slightly sinister accent. She was a German woman. As I got older, there were the war stories of boyhood culture, the heroic war films on the rented TV set, the comics. My particular pleasure was one called The Victor, which featured World War II combat stories centred on the manly deeds of British military heroes. But I also grew up with a different kind of war story, those of my parents. My father's stories about his experience during the war centred on three decisive life-changing themes. First of all, he met my mum while they were both working with a crowd of other 17-year-olds at the Doncaster Inland Revenue, or as they called it, taxes. So the war was a time of love and courtship, and its ending made it possible to marry and raise a family. The second theme in my dad's war stories is that of his own survival. Despite being, his word, desperate to train as a pilot, he ended up in the army, the King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry. With hindsight, he understands afterwards that his disappointment, paradoxically, may have saved his life. In the army, his draft overseas kept being deferred for one reason or another. I finished up, he told me in an interview I did with him in 1982, working my way out of the draft system into the office, where I was posting clerk, putting other people on draft. Well, from there, when I realised that the number was catching up on me and I was going to get clobbered myself, I posted myself to a civil resettlement unit for returning soldiers. My dad was unheroic and proud of it. This was an unexceptional stance, as Pete Grafton demonstrates in his oral history, You, and You, the people out of step with World War II, that came out the year before I interviewed my dad in 1981. But It's an experience marginalised and even silenced by British public memory that's focused on celebrating the mythic fighting nation with its blitz spirit, united behind its totemic leader Churchill. The third key theme in my dad's memories of wartime is the opening of the door to education that occurred for him in the army. A working class lad who'd won a place at grammar school but dropped out because it separated him from the life of his friends and family. In the army, I can't quite remember where now, an officer approached me and asked me in quiet conversation, "What are you doing in the infantry? Why don't you transfer to the Army Education Corps?" Who, me? And that was the beginning of it. I decided I would do that. Anything to get away from this infantry lark. I still have some of the books from that time my dad studied, like this one, G.M. Trevelyan's classic, The History of England, republished in December 1944. It's signed by my dad, and there's a stamp in the left-hand side there, Number 4 Military Disembarkation Unit, and it's dated the 6th of September 1945. I used this book as a core text when I was preparing for my A-level history exam. After the war, my father trained as a school teacher under the Emergency Teacher Training Scheme, designed to replenish the profession after the losses sustained by the cohort of young male teachers who had become combatants. My father's commitment to the value of education sustained his long teaching career, but also lay at the core of our family life. It inspired my mother to return to study and train as an infant teacher in midlife, and it was the reason I went to university, the first of my family to do so. The expansion in educational opportunities in Britain is one very tangible, positive legacy of the Second World War, generated by public investment under the rubric of post-war reconstruction and the building of a new Britain. In 1962, I went to a spanking new primary school, and 12 years later to the Universities of York and Sussex, new institutions built and opened in the early 1960s. So my professorship then grows out of this post-war legacy, though I have to insist it's also rooted in the unheroic wangling and opportunism of the wartime working class. As Anna Carden-Coyne writes in her wonderful book, Reconstructing the Body, about post-war culture in the aftermath of the First World War, but equally applicable to the Second, enormous suffering and grief were terrifying consequences of mass warfare, and yet this truth is not the entire story. People also rebuilt their lives, their communities, and their bodies, immersed in efforts to heal the violence and triumph over adversity. Reconstruction motivated politicians, professionals, and individuals to transform themselves and their societies. Legacies of war shape public culture and private lives, and they bind them together in ways that are inescapably political. Today, my post-war generation also finds itself in a fight to defend the valuable material legacies of post-1945 reconstruction from the current neoliberal onslaught on the welfare state, on the National Health Service, on the very idea of public education and the public university. And this is a fight that involves a cross-generational alliance with those still alive who lived through the war and with the younger generations who live their relationship to this past in very different ways. My second case is that of the war known euphemistically as the Irish Troubles, 1969 to when? Is it over? Maybe 1998 is a date that might be used. We'll see. Contingency is at work. Northern Ireland is a place where the wars of the past, though, cast long and dark shadows, and where collective memory work has reproduced and reworked their significance for politics and identity across the generations. In Ulster British cultural memory, for example, key anniversaries of events in the 17th century are commemorated every year through parading and other practices. 1641, the massacre of Protestants at the River Bann Bridge. 1689, the relief of the Siege of Derry. 1690, the victory of Protestant King William of Orange, there he is, at the Battle of the Boyne. Ritualised public commemoration and what loyalists formed by the Orange tradition call the stories learned at my mother's knee transmit mythic narratives of trauma, fear, annihilation, and the necessity of constant vigilance in self-defence. This is the psychic and political stance referred to under the slogan, "No surrender." As Estin Evans pointed out back in 1951, remember 1690, one of those crisp Ulster Wall slogans, is not the motto of an historical cult so much as the reminder of present-day threats to the Ulsterman's security and independence. Northern Ireland is also a place where war is a matter of living memory for a population emerging from the political violence that erupted again in 1969. This brutal and largely clandestine armed conflict had two dimensions. First, the insurgency waged by the Provisional Irish Republican Army and other Republican groups against the British military presence that had established and sustained the partition of Ireland and was responsible for the resulting injustices experienced by the nationalist minority in the north that my family came from. And second, a sectarian war waged against the IRA and the Republican communities that supported it by loyalist paramilitary groups, most notably the Ulster Defence Association and the Ulster Volunteer Force. My own relationship to this conflict has a number of roots, the deepest of which lead back to that wedding photo from 1946. I was born of a mixed marriage between my English Anglican-raised but atheist father and my Irish Catholic mother, whose own parents had migrated from Newry in the north of Ireland to the Yorkshire coalfield, where my mother was born and grew up in an Irish migrant community. My identification with my mother's Irishness, as well as with my dad's Englishness, gave rise to a sense of affiliation, connection and responsibility in relation to the conflict which came to dominate the TV news after 1968. Involvement in activism and educational work around the Irish conflict, for me, followed in the 1980s, propelled by key events in the war, including the bombing of the Grand Hotel here in Brighton, my hometown, in 1984. In 1996, I began researching for my book, Making Peace with the Past, which explores how the cultural memory and trauma of the conflict has affected the Irish peace process. Launching the Irish peace process in December 1993 with their joint declaration on peace, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and the Prime Minister of the Republic of Ireland pledged to work together to, quote, remove the causes of conflict, to overcome the legacy of history and to heal the divisions which have resulted. Since the declaration, political negotiations have delivered the paramilitary ceasefires of 1994, the Belfast Good Friday Agreement of 1998. This established the basis for an agreed political settlement, including institutions to enable devolved power-sharing government and equality of citizenship, underpinned by human rights legislation. The so-called decommissioning of the IRA's military arsenal was accomplished in 2005, accompanied by so-called demilitarisation by the British state. And in 2008, democratic elections were held to form the new Northern Ireland Assembly, which established a governing executive. Today, 20 years after the signing of the declaration, the political settlement has removed some of the major causes of the conflict, and the war is largely over, although unionist discontent over the terms of settlement persists and sustained, if low-intensity, political violence continues. The basis has been created for new political and social relationships with possibilities for working towards what the devolved government has described as a shared future. However, conflict transformation is an altogether longer project that proceeds at a different temporal rhythm to the political transition from violence to democracy. It's confronted by powerful and damaging legacies of violence-induced division and polarisation. These play out on multiple and interrelated levels, in cultures, in social space, in subjectivities. For example, the conflicting political identities of Ulster Unionism and Irish nationalism continue to be asserted and reproduced in commemorative cultures that tell highly selective and adversarial narratives about the past. The anniversaries of their key dates, 1641, 1690, 1798, 1916, are celebrated in annual rituals of parading and commemorated in the murals for which Northern Ireland has become famous. As in these examples, photographed in 2004 from the memoryscapes, in this case of the Loyalist Shankill. This is a mural and a set of flags commemorating the 36th Ulster Division. I don't know whether you can see this at the back clearly. 36th Ulster Division, Battle of the Somme, 1st of July 1916. And the memoryscape of the Nationalist and Republican Falls Road. This is a mural dedicated to the women of 1916, the women of Cumann na Ban, of Sinn Féin, of Ógla Nairn. These commemorative cultures also articulate memories of events in the more recent conflict, of violence that our community has had to suffer and for which the other is held responsible. Here we see a mural and memorial on the Shankill Road commemorating a series of Republican bomb attacks which killed civilians and children in the immediate area. The slogan at the top of the gable end, 30 years of indiscriminate slaughter by so-called non-sectarian Irish freedom fighters. Across the peace line barrier in the Republican Falls, we find murals like this commemoration to the 10 Republican hunger strikers who died in the H-blocks in 1981. Controversial parades continue to provide flashpoints of violent confrontation, like the 12th of July march by the Orange Order past the nationalist Ardoyne area of North Belfast that is opposed as triumphalist and inflammatory by local residents groups. It triggered days of serious rioting just this summer after it was banned by the Northern Ireland Parades Commission. The former US presidential envoy to Northern Ireland, Richard Haas, is currently in the North chairing all-party talks set up by the Assembly to try to reach consensus on how to tackle divisive parades and other forms and expressions of identity. Developing ways through local negotiation to acknowledge and allow space for the different cultural symbols and commemorative traditions of the other, whilst removing their potential for inflammatory provocation, is now seen as central to reducing divisiveness and building new relationships. This has proved possible, for example, in Derry, Londonderry, where in August this year the annual parade of the Loyalist Apprentice Boys of Derry was successfully incorporated into the Derry City of Culture Festival and passed off peacefully. An alternative approach to the contested past advocates abandoning or discouraging any potentially divisive commemoration, as in the case of the Arts Council of Northern Ireland's current Reimagining Communities programme. And this promotes the removal of murals with militaristic themes and their replacement with less controversial images. Reimaging communities, not reimagining. And the removal of these militaristic themes, their replacement with less controversial images, George Best, C.S. Lewis, the Titanic, have all featured in East Belfast. Here we have the Ship of Dreams. The Titanic was built in the Belfast Harland and Wolff shipyard, now having seen better days. Has recently been reclaimed as a unificatory symbol of the post-conflict city's supposedly shared heritage, under the slogan, "It was fine when it left Belfast." However, the £97 million Titanic Experience Heritage Centre, which you can see here, a rather extraordinary building, situated in the shipyard area. Here we've got the Harland and Wolff gantry, famous gantry, and over here to the left, oh dear, this is the slip wave where the Titanic went into the water. So this is a whole heritage zone with this fancy new building with an interactive museum display in it. It's already established as one of the city's attractions for residents and also for visitors who come in. But it avoids, instead of engages, with the legacy of the shipyard itself as a site of sectarian division and violence. These kind of debates about what to do about potentially divisive commemoration are linked in Northern Ireland and Belfast in highly specific ways to broader concerns about the continuing effects of polarisation and division within a divided city where the majority of people from Catholic or Protestant communities live in places that are at least 81% Catholic or Protestant, segregated areas, and where access not only to housing but also to education, to employment, to urban facilities and services, to opportunities for social mixing are structured by what Peter Sherlow and his colleague Murta call ethno-sectarianised space. The legacy of polarised identities commonly manifests within post-conflict subjectivities as fear, as hostility, as suspicion, as distrust of the other ethno-sectarian group. Other effective legacies of past political violence, including anger, sadness, hatred, guilt, humiliation, persist into the present, often in the form of traumatic psychic disturbance that remains difficult to grasp, to acknowledge, to integrate within the self or the family or the community. Effective legacies also permeate public institutions and public debate. And central here are discourses concerning the victims of violence, the more than 3,700 people who died as a result of the recent troubles, the 50,000 plus who suffered serious injury, and all those who mourn and care for them. Coming to terms with the past is one way of describing a struggle that occurs afterwards to find a way of living in and living with this emotional and affective aftermath of political violence, of bereavement, and of injury. The experiences of victims of violence are fundamental to ongoing demands that post-conflict society in Northern Ireland finds ways of addressing unresolved legacies of the violent past in terms of truth and of justice. These have become known, truth and justice, as the legacy issues in current debate. As the controversy following last week's BBC Panorama programme that some of you will have seen or read about shows, these issues retain and generate an intense affective charge. On the Panorama programme, former soldiers in the British Army's secret Special Forces unit, the Military Reaction Force, admitted to illegal shoot-to-kill operations in the early 1970s in West Belfast that targeted unarmed nationalist civilians as well as suspected IRA volunteers. Such revelations by ex-combatants may prove deeply disturbing to the relatives of their victims even 40 years after the event. Patricia McVeigh, who's featured in the news a lot recently and the programme, whose father Patrick was one of those killed, has expressed the family's commitment to gaining further information and clearing his name. She says, "We just would like the Military Reaction Force to stand up at a new inquest and tell the truth. It shouldn't go down in history that my father was shot dead, perhaps because he was in the IRA. He wasn't in the IRA. We need the truth to be told." The family's solicitor, Padraig Murray, who's pressing for a new inquest, has explained the McVeigh family know that Patrick was unarmed, that he was a civilian, that he was shot by plainclothes soldiers. What they don't know is who gave those orders, who was directly involved. No soldiers have ever been brought before a criminal court. In their view, there's been no proper investigation into this whole matter. Those of you that followed the Bloody Sunday inquiry will note the echoes of that more famous, more public experience in her words. The public debate provoked by the Panorama interviews meshed last week with the greater controversy, so they got less coverage actually, funnily enough, over here, perhaps not funnily at all, the greater controversy surrounding proposals made by Northern Ireland's foremost lawyer, the Attorney General John Larkin, to, quote, bring an end to all prosecutions, all inquests, and all public inquiries concerning Troubles-related deaths prior to the 1998 agreement. Here's an excellent example of the strategy, the attempted strategy of drawing a line under the past in order to move on. There continues to be in Northern Ireland a lack of consensus about how to address these issues and how to resolve the conflicting interests involved. The most comprehensive proposals to date have been those of the consultative group on the past set up in 2007 by the British government, which made detailed recommendations in its report of 2009. But the emotive and critical reception given to the report by some sections of Northern Ireland's public caused a number of commentators to conclude that it is, this is a quote from the Irish Times, too soon to ask Northern Ireland to set about an official and systematic exploration of the history of the Troubles. The government parked the report. Too soon. When one wonders, will the time for such investigation be thought ripe? To judge by the response to the Attorney General's proposals last week by the Conservative MP David Davis, that time may already have passed. There comes a time, wrote Davis last week, when we should accept that no matter how many more investigations we hold, or how many more witnesses we call, or how much money we spend, they're unlikely to achieve anything more of use. That time has come, he says. For Northern Ireland, the path to lasting peace lies in looking to the future, not raking up the past. Many people in Northern Ireland, perhaps even in this room, will find this remark deeply offensive and dismissive. For the victims of violence, the conflicted past doesn't need to be raked up, as it already permeates every aspect of life. It galvanises continuing demands for the fullest possible disclosure of information and for accountability and redress through some mechanism of justice. And that movement is very much alive and flourishing in Northern Ireland, and the controversy about the Attorney General's comments suggests that they will be very difficult to get those proposals through. By contrast, though, to conclude this second section, here in Britain, where the armed forces of the state were principal actors in this war, and where many people here in Britain, in British towns and cities, including in this city, still live with the effective legacies of death and injury suffered by British soldiers and by civilian victims of the IRA's mainland bombing campaign, the debate about legacies of the Troubles has barely begun. In the last part of my talk, I'm going to reflect on legacies of war in my third case. This is a case I've been drawn to think about seriously think about, only in the last few years, and it's the case of Palestine. And my starting point is this image. This is the image that I borrowed. Mark, the designer, flipped it round and cropped it and made it into the striking poster that we saw earlier to advertise my lecture. This photograph was taken on the 4th of August 2003. It depicts 3 young Palestinian boys walking alongside the military fortification described by the Israeli government as the security fence, built by the state to protect its people from attack by Palestinian suicide bombers. The fortification is known by the Palestinians, whose life it has transformed, as the apartheid wall, and probably many other things, that restricts their mobility, enables confiscation of their land and water supplies to serve the interests of Israeli settlements, and over time is intended to compel departure from their living spaces on either side. In 2004, the International Court of Justice issued an advisory ruling that found the Israeli wall to be in breach of international law and the UN Charter, and called for further construction to be stopped immediately. Israel has ignored the ruling and continued to extend the barrier which, when completed, is expected to run for some 650 kilometres. In 2009, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights called for the barrier to be dismantled in its entirety, and measures adopted for the full restoration of Palestinian human rights, stating the wall is but one element of the wider system of severe restrictions on the freedom of movement imposed by the Israeli authorities on Palestinian residents in the occupied territories. Now, the particular location of the photograph is the stretch of the wall. This is a map that shows in red the route of the wall around the West Bank. And the particular photo is taken on the west side of the Palestinian town of Kalkalia, here, where you can see, even on this rather crude and small little map, a kind of spaghetti effect rather than a nice, neat line. Here, the wall consists of a concrete structure, 25 feet high. And on this map, I'll analyse some of the. This is a zoom in on that spaghetti. The black line is the wall. It completely encircles the town of Kalkalia and shoots off in a number of other little directions around, or big directions around here. It encircles the town, effectively caging its 46,000 inhabitants, who have egress only through a single military checkpoint in the eastern section and through a tunnel that is now the only way, except going all the way around, 16 kilometres, that you can get from Kalkalia to the nearby town of Habla, which is just over 1.5 kilometres away. The tunnel runs under an Israeli settler-only road that runs through that gap. Palestinians are barred from using this road. The road connects the Israeli settlement built in the 1980s, which is expanding the purple bit, the other bits where it's planned, of Alpha Menash, which is several kilometres inside the occupied territories, to connect the settlement with Israel. At Kalkalia, as in many of its other sections, the wall designed to separate the West Bank from Israel is constructed east of the Green Line, which is the 1967 border prior to the occupation, recognised by the UN as the basis for any two-state solution. And you can see the Green Line running down there and there. So the wall cuts off the two towns from their hinterland, these areas here. The green are agricultural areas used by people in these towns. It cuts them off from the hinterland of villages, from agricultural lands, from access to aquifers. The Palestinian villages in these areas, this area here, a number of villages, are now isolated in this strange space between the Green Line and the wall. This is an area categorised under the Oslo Accords as Area C. Thus, it's a closed military zone under the full control of the Israeli military authorities, now effectively annexed into Israel. And the movement in or out of this zone by the Palestinians that live there requires a pass permit issued by the military authorities. Now, I chose this image for my inaugural poster because it speaks so simply and powerfully about the themes of my lecture. The structure of the Israeli occupation and the experience of those who live under its shadow are both evoked by this photograph. The wall, stretching into the distance as far as the eye can see, looms over the three boys, whose backs are turned to the sinister military watchtower, concealing its sophisticated surveillance technologies and its potential lethal firepower. The boys, who will have by now grown into teenagers and young men, if they're still alive, are relaxed, smiling, and convey a sense of unquenched spirit, a capacity to get on with life and enjoy it in their own way, regardless of their oppressive and dangerous environment. The photograph also leads me to two further reflections about the experience of Palestinian children under Israeli occupation. And the first reflection takes me back to Jean Maux's photographs of children in his book with Edward Said about Palestinian experience After the Last Sky, published in 1986. And Said wrote there, "None of us can forget the whispers and occasional proclamations that our children constitute special targets for death. I heard it said in Lebanon that Palestinian children in particular should be killed because each of them is a potential terrorist. Kill them before they kill you." And Palestinian children certainly die and are injured in large numbers and on a regular basis in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. During Operation Cast Lead, the 22-day offensive against Gaza by the combined Israeli Air Force, Army and Navy from 27th of December 2008 until the 18th of January 2009, in those 22 days, 355 Palestinian children were killed. 13 of those children were classified as combatants. And 1,872 were wounded. According to Amnesty, in its report released in July 2009, children playing on the roofs of their homes or in the street and other civilians going about their daily business were killed in broad daylight by hellfire and other highly accurate missiles fired in no warning attacks by F-16 combat aircraft, whose operators can see even the small details of their targets and which can accurately strike even fast-moving vehicles. Disturbing questions remain unanswered, say Amnesty, about why these weapons killed children. And we should bear in mind in the Gaza Strip that there was no way out, that the Gaza Strip is also surrounded by a wall controlled by Israel, which made it impossible for the population to flee that bombardment. Only last month, MAP, Medical Aid for Palestinians, reported that in just 1 week in September 2013, 83 children in the West Bank were injured by Israeli soldiers. One, a 6-year-old boy in Hebron, was shot in the face with a rubber-coated steel bullet by an Israeli soldier as he got off a bus with his mother and sisters. He lost an eye, which might have been saved had the ambulance taking him to hospital for specialist surgery not been held up for 5 hours waiting for the Israeli authorities to give it permission to travel to the hospital in East Jerusalem. Matt provides a range of testimony about the systematic failure of the occupying power to uphold the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, 1989, including its Article 38. Parties shall take all feasible measures to ensure protection and care of children who are affected by an armed conflict. Palestinian children enjoy no such rights. My second reflection prompted by the photograph is that Palestine raises entirely different issues to those discussed in my previous two cases, with major implications for how we understand the meaning of post-war. Because several generations of Palestinian children have now grown up in the 65-year-long aftermath of al-Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948, when the establishment of the State of Israel was accompanied by what Ilan Pappé has analysed as an ethnic cleansing of Palestinian towns and villages, leading to the destruction of Palestinian society, the displacement of the Palestinian people from their land. Since the defeat of Arab armies in the Six-Day War of 1967, this long post-war shadow of 1948 has been overlaid by another one, that of the occupation, which has now lasted 46 years, a period of unremitting conflict in which nothing is ever settled. For the boys in the photograph, their conditions of life and their sense of identity are overshadowed not only by the wall, but by these defeats of the past and the unfinished national struggle towards an imagined future based on the desired realisation of full political and human rights. In After the Last Sky, Edward Said writes, "We Palestinians live in a protracted not yet, which is not always a very hopeful one." And here Said prompts us to think of the occupied territories as existing in a kind of time suspended, caught between an afterwards that's not yet become past and a not yet which is unable to progress into the future. Julie Petit has proposed a way of understanding the politics of time in this context. Israeli colonialism, she argues, has established a different, timeless and motionless zone for the Palestinians, distinct from the settlers' modernity and civilization. While Israelis enjoy speed, freedom of movement and expansion through space, Palestinian space shrinks, time slows, mobility is constricted. The Israeli regime of military checkpoints, walls, permits, searches and other constraining techniques functions, suggests Petit, to steal Palestinian time through myriad tactics of enforced waiting. While so-called final status political negotiations to achieve the two-state solution are endlessly delayed, the Israeli settlements, initially presented as temporary, gradually become permanent. What Petit calls a sort of slow-motion ethnic cleansing replaces the fast-paced military operations of 1948 and 67 as the best means to achieve the dispossession and displacement of Palestinians. How should we understand the relation of this reality to our own post-war culture? And how can we, or should we, engage with culture that inhabits a time and space so different to anything experienced in Britain? I want to end by talking very briefly about a narrative that asks exactly these questions. Peter Kaminsky's fictional TV drama of 2011, The Promise. This makes a connection between the endless afterwards of the Palestinian existence and resistance since 1948 and British history, memory and forgetting. It focuses on the end of the British political rule under the League of Nations mandate for Palestine that lasted from 1922 until 1948, and on the British military withdrawal that accompanied the Declaration of Independence establishing the State of Israel. Thousands of British families have members who served in the armed forces in Palestine during and after the Second World War up until the end of the mandate. But this history is largely lost to British popular memory and absent from British versions of our post-war period after World War II. The Promise does this through exploring two stories. One is the story of Len Matthews, a young British soldier who arrives in Palestine fresh from the liberation of the Nazi death camps and is plunged into the confusing and compromised political process of British conflict management, torn between his friendships and identifications with the Jews he meets and with the Arabs he meets, but subjected quite soon to the campaign of the Irgun militia to drive the British out of Palestine. In the late 1940s, at the very moment my mum and dad were getting married. The second strand explores the British national forgetting of the history of the mandate and stages its contemporary rediscovery through the tropes of family history and the journey. This works through a parallel narrative set in 2005, which reconstructs the story of Len Matthews, the soldier, through his diary, found by and that fascinates his young granddaughter Erin, and it provides the fictional device motivating the drama's temporal return to the 1940s. Erin travels around a comparable journey around present-day Israel in the occupied territories. The journey eventually takes her to Gaza, and it ends with her witnessing a punitive Israeli house demolition inflicted on a family in reprisal for a suicide bombing. Witnessing transforms for Erin into an act of solidarity with the family as she attempts to obstruct the giant bulldozer and halt the demolition, as indeed peace activists have attempted. In The Promise, Erin's gesture of solidarity is ultimately futile. It doesn't stop the demolition, and she returns home to England deeply troubled by her experience and unsure where it leaves her. The Promise leaves its viewers too with questions about the intertwining of history, memory and lived experience in Britain and in Palestine, Israel. About the kinds of relations and responsibilities we have, or ought to have, collectively and individually, towards others who are differently positioned within that shared history. And about the kinds of acts of witnessing, of solidarity, that might give meaningful form to those relations and responsibilities? I will leave you with those same questions. Thank you very much for listening.